research by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. They detailed 800 years of financial history looking at sovereign nations across the spectrum from developing countries to developed countries. And they found very strong evidence that financial crises and fiscally driven financial crises in sovereign nations are quite common, and they tend to occur especially after a huge run-up and build-up in sovereign debt, like we're seeing now. And that comes along with this view of this time is different. So if the United States fails, if our fiscal policy gets so far out of control that the dollar loses that value as the world's global reserve currency, that would have global implications. I don't think any country would be shielded from the fallout. So what happens here affects the entire world. We don't know where the fallout is going to be. And if the stock market starts declining, investors may pull out of all sorts of things because all the prices have been distorted by this huge infusion of money that was done with the explicit stated purpose. Bernanke is on the record for saying that the purpose of QE is to increase asset prices to create a wealth illusion, to get people to spend more and invest more as a result of feeling wealthier.
Welcome back to Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest who is quite popular in her first appearance here. Romina Boccia is with the Heritage Foundation. She's here with us to talk about the plight that retirees are in, looking at the burgeoning debt burden, and also to answer some of your viewer questions. Romina, thanks for joining us again here on Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks, Donegan, for having me. It's my pleasure. I had so much fun last time. I couldn't wait to come back.
We're glad you did. I've been through a major illness. You've been through an illness, and now we're both trying to get back in the saddle here. So hopefully this will hold out. We're also dealing with some technical difficulties, but we'll get past that. So the first thing we wanted to talk to you about was, the Heritage Foundation in general, and you in specific, have spoken quite a bit on different media outlets about the reality that is really unprecedented in the history of the financial world, of the debt burden that sovereign nations, states, and individuals are bearing. Can you tell us connect the dots for us on what impact that has, or what implications it has on people who are approaching retirement or who are in retirement, as far as the risks that they're going to have to bear because of that?
Yes, we find ourselves in very strange times at the moment that I worry are giving lawmakers across the globe, but especially in the United States, the impression that this time is different, that deficits no longer matter, that sovereign nations can take on basically unlimited amounts of debt without causing harmful consequences to their economies and to their people. And that is a very, very dangerous perception, because it can feed the exact activities with lawmakers over leveraging the fiscal finances, overburdening the budgets with more and more debt leverage, and setting the stage for a massive fiscal crisis. That is and that is not even a black swan event. That is what we have found if you look at research by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. They detailed 800 years of financial history looking at sovereign nations across the spectrum from developing countries to developed countries. And they found very strong evidence that financial crises and fiscally driven financial crises in sovereign nations are quite common, and they tend to occur especially after a huge run-up and build-up in sovereign debt, like we're seeing now. And that comes along with this view of this time is different. because countries find themselves going through a relative period of prosperity and lack of debt crises, and they grow complacent. Their lawmakers grow complacent, and they start over-leveraging themselves, and they're able to do that for a while. The problem is when crisis hits, it tends to hit without much advance notice. It's not like we can take on a lot of debt and then we'll just stop before there's a fiscal crisis. The problem is that by us taking on this debt and assuming a fiscal crisis will never hit, we're setting the stage for that very crisis that will hit us all of a sudden.
We've had in recent years, like for example, President Obama had a famous quote, the debt is not a problem because after all we owe it to ourselves. And also we've had people talk about modern monetary theory. In fact, we have a whole crop of current presidential candidates that are espousing the virtues of how you can just keep increasing spending without ill effect. Can you tell us about the realities of, do we in fact owe the debt to ourselves? What does that mean? And secondly, what does modern monetary theory have to do with reality?
Yeah, so that idea that we owe the debt to ourselves, the idea is that if a country holds its debt domestically, which by the way in the United States is not the case, at least not for roughly half of our debt, but assume that the government issues debt and all of the debt is owned by citizens of that country, then when those bonds come due, the money also goes to the citizens of that country. So the idea is that in that scenario, we owe debt to ourselves. But that assumes also that there are no real resources that the government is using up with that debt. The whole idea behind the government borrowing from its population in this example is to buy real resources and put them to work. That is manpower, that can be infrastructure, that can be resources like minerals, oil, energy, other resources. And the government, the problem is with the spending. The borrowing is just one way in which the government is spending. But this conception that we owe it to ourselves is not even true in the U.S. context. And it's not true for many countries. Basically, if you borrow from abroad, that's no longer true, because now we actually owe that money to foreigners, to foreign investors. We no longer owe it to ourselves. So interest payments don't go towards the U.S. population. They go to China, they go to Japan, they go to investors in Europe. So that argument that we owe it to ourselves doesn't work in the case where you have foreign investors, but it also doesn't work if you look at our population, because you owe it to a different generation usually. And even if that's not the case, the way that we're repaying the debt or servicing the debt, that's based on whom the tax burden falls. And those aren't necessarily the same people who are holding those government bonds. So you're still shifting the burden from a certain group of people to another group of people. So even if we owe it to ourselves, we're not just one entity. You know, we're separate people, we're different individuals, and we don't necessarily owe it to ourselves in that sense, unless you think of everyone in the United States as just one blob. We're all the same, like the society. A society is made up of individuals, and ultimately the bondholders do not necessarily reflect the people that will be hit with the debt burden, whether that's their children, future generations, immigrants, or different people because of the way we've allocated our tax burden.
How about that question about modern monetary theory, that you can always just paper over any problem by just creating more money? Whatever you need in the future, that problem will go away because you'll just create more money. Yeah.
That's really not a new theory. All that is saying, dressed up with red lipstick, is that a sovereign nation that issues its own currency can never default on its debt unless it makes a political decision to do so, because that country can always just print more of its own currency. Of course, many countries have tried this, and we have a current example in Latin America, in Venezuela. Venezuela, basically, when they nationalized their oil industry, which was their major export, capacity dropped significantly, exports as a result dropped significantly, and the country brought in less money. At the same time, their economy was in significant decline because of bad socialist policies and what their government resorted to in order to finance their growing welfare state and provide their population with all the social entitlement benefits that they had promised them when they adopted socialism in this country, is that they just started printing bolivars like crazy, like there was no limit to it. And what's happened? They're experiencing hyperinflation to the tune of 10,000% inflation. That is the kind of inflation we're talking about in Venezuela. And that happened because they just printed money. So they basically engaged in modern monetary theory, and the result was hyperinflation. That doesn't sound like a responsible fiscal or monetary policy to me.
So far, we've been talking about the United States primarily as a federal sovereign entity. What about other municipalities like the states and counties and so on? Is the same problem that's been happening at the national level in the U.S.? Well, first of all, maybe you can tell us, is the same thing happening in other countries? But secondly, within the U.S., is it happening at all the levels as well?
So right now, the U.S. is the top nation in terms of having a growing debt burden as a percentage of GDP. We're at the very top, meaning we are the very worst right now in terms of taking on additional debt relative to the size of our economy. There are other countries that have problems, but the big issue is the United States is a much bigger country. Our economy is one of the largest in the world. Also, our currency underlies the strength of global financial markets. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, and a lot of the financial transactions that happen all over the world are based on US dollars. That means major commodities like oil and others are dollarized, but also even the SWIFT system of banking relies on the US dollar as its foundation. So if the United States fails, if our fiscal policy gets so far out of control that the dollar loses that value as the world's global reserve currency, that would have global implications. I don't think any country would be shielded from the fallout. So what happens here affects the entire world. That's not true with some of the other countries that are taking on large loads of debt. But what we've actually seen, especially since the Great Recession, is that many countries have adopted better fiscal policies, particularly fiscal rules. We're referring to them as second-generation fiscal rules because many countries, when the Great Recession hit, their revenues declined as their economies collapsed and their government spending went up because more people were in need of benefits. They adopted fiscal rules in order to rebalance their budgets, reduce their deficits. So in many European countries, especially the Nordic countries and Germany, we've seen surpluses, budget surpluses. And then some of the other nations that are dependent on the euro, like Spain and Portugal, they've been feeling pressure from the European Union to improve some of their finances as well. But if we had a major fiscal problem in Italy or Portugal, the fallout from that would be largely focused in the euro area. It wouldn't impact the entire globe the way that a U.S. Fiscal crisis would. So that is one big difference.
How about within the U.S., in addition to the federal deficit and the risks that can impose, what about state and major metropolitan areas like Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, that kind of thing?
So the big problem we're seeing in the States is one of a pension crisis. And we do have a pension crisis. And we have a pension crisis both in the multi-employer pension system, which is the union-run private pension system that is, however, insured by the Federal Pension Guarantee Corporation. So there is some federal involvement there. And we have there an underfunding crisis of about $700 billion. And if you look at state and local pensions, so those municipalities, the firefighters, et cetera, there you have an underfunding crisis to the tune of $6 to $7 trillion. And the big issue is if the federal government adopts a position of offering bailouts to the states, that can very quickly unravel that underfunding crisis and cause the federal government to take on a lot more debt very quickly, causing the federal fiscal situation to deteriorate rapidly, potentially triggering that fiscal crisis. So it's extremely important that lawmakers make it very clear that municipalities and cities need to get their own fiscal house in order. That might mean having to reduce benefits for some beneficiaries. It might mean having to increase contributions among workers currently paying into the system in order to make these systems solvent. What's happened both in the multi-employer pension system and for state and local government pension managers is that they have assumed unrealistically high rates of return on their investments, to the tune of 8, 10, sometimes 12%, which would be nice if you could have that. But that's just not what happened. And especially in this low interest environment, pensions are suffering because they're not getting the returns from, say, investments in treasury bonds. And because they're defined benefit pensions, they shouldn't take on as risky an investment as, say, a defined contribution pension because they still owe the benefits, whether they have the money to pay those benefits or not. That's the trouble with the defined benefit system, of course, is you can promise a benefit without the ability to pay. And so right now, actually, the multi-employer pension crisis has gotten some attention in Congress, and there was recently a small bailout for the coal miners. But that, unfortunately, opens the door to bailing out more of those plans, which then also makes it harder for the federal government to tell cities like Detroit and Chicago, we're not going to come to your rescue, because if the federal government is bailing out private union pension plans, how can they tell to their own cities that they're not going to bail out their pensioners? So we are very quickly going down a very slippery slope to potentially bailing out up to $7 trillion in these state, local, and private pension plans. And if you look at our current national debt, it's $23 trillion. So that's a huge amount. That's adding about 30% to our national debt.
If we could turn to some viewer questions, some of these will maybe touch on themes you've already introduced, but it's of great concern to our viewers. Anthony Alpha says, I'd like to ask, if the Fed thinks it can exit itself from the current not QE repo mess, can they?
I don't know that they even think that they can, because there was some discussion a long time ago that they would discontinue this program, and yet we haven't seen that happening. And there's no plan that we have seen, no plan that I'm aware that they even have in their back pockets for how to reduce the vast liabilities that a Federal Reserve has assumed as a direct result of the QE policies following the financial crises. So this does seem to be a new normal, and also, unfortunately, sets the stage for potentially modern monetary theory, or to be applied, or in a more limited or informal way for lawmakers like our president to exert pressure on the Federal Reserve to continue an easy money policy in order to finance federal government operations. I mean, we should be very clear that one of the biggest beneficiaries of QE and of this easy money policy that the Fed has been practicing has been the federal government in the form of reduced interest rates on treasury bonds.
Right. We were just speaking with Gregory Mannarino earlier this week, and he talked about that no one can know the true cost of the debt when it's being underpriced because of this artificially suppressed interest rate environment that's not truly reflecting a market rate.
No, and what it also does is it's building huge bubbles. It is inflating assets in the stock market, and it is distorting those prices that we observe in the stock market, but we don't know exactly where, and so we don't know where the fallout is going to be. And if the stock market starts declining, investors may pull out of all sorts of things, because all the prices have been distorted by this huge infusion of money that was done with the explicit stated purpose. Bernanke is on the record for saying that the purpose of QE is to increase asset prices, to create a wealth illusion, to get people to spend more and invest more as a result of feeling wealthier. That's the purpose behind it. It's not about strengthening economic fundamentals, but it's about basically creating a bubble so people think they're wealthier, and then hopefully that will spur the real economy. But we haven't seen those investments happen in the real economy. The money has been going primarily into the stock market, but not necessarily towards more investment, more innovation. The way that you grow an economy with strong economic fundamentals is by having productivity enhancing innovations that push out our productivity curve, that push out what's possible in our economy. But we really haven't seen much of that. And much of that money has also been flowing towards sort of these unicorn startups, some of which have been money losers for many, many years now. But because it seems like money is free, at least it's very cheap, it keeps flowing in that direction and is distorting real market fundamentals, which also has me worried that when when the song ends, we're gonna experience a much more massive crisis than would have been the case if we had adopted better policies following the Great Recession, rather than just boosting asset prices in the stock market, so people would feel wealthier and hopefully spend some money.
There's a follow-on question by the same Anthony Alpha who says, assuming that the Fed can't extract themselves from this not QE, which you explained as the new normal, how can or will we know when the repo problems are manifest in the banking system and the economy at large?
For that, I would need to refer you to one of my colleagues, especially Norbert Michel, who's an expert on private banking. I focus more on federal fiscal policy and our debt load, so that's beyond my wheelhouse.
All right. Well, back to the question that we started out on is you mentioned that some of these multi-employer and private pensions are going to be in trouble. In addition to that, what risks are ordinary middle-class wage earners who've been paying into Social Security, who've been paying into their pension plans or 401ks, and you again have alluded to that if the assets that are underlying 401ks or IRAs are in a bubble, that's an inherent risk there.
Right.
But could you kind of outline for us the risks that the ordinary person needs to be aware of that they may not be aware of?
Yeah, so for Social Security, we know that it is severely underfunded, and there's the potential for a 25% automatic benefit cut unless lawmakers decide to avoid that in some way. Of course, the longer lawmakers wait and the more debt they build up, that makes it harder to fix that problem down the road. And so there will likely be some combination of benefit cuts and tax increases to address Social Security at some point. The sooner we do that, the better for current retirees, because, of course, we want to preserve benefits for those already in the system, especially the more vulnerable who might not have other sources of income to finance their retirement. And we should start making adjustments for the younger generation, including continuing the gradual increase in the retirement age to shore up the financing. But if we had a massive fiscal crisis in this country, it doesn't really matter what we do in that space, because that's going to affect everyone and will especially hurt the most vulnerable, because that might mean that we need to reduce benefits across the board. And if the federal government loses its ability to borrow at reasonable rates, and potentially we could experience a inflationary scenario where the US dollar comes into question, that's going to have broad implications for everyone. That's sort of the worst case scenario, but with current policies, we're very much heading towards that. So it's good for folks, I think, to diversify, to be aware of the shaky foundation that unfortunately our financial system rests at the moment, the underfunding and looming insolvency of the Social Security program that people should not expect to be relying on that program alone, that in order to be financially secure, they also should have another nest egg. And then the question is, where do you invest that? And I think if you have a crisis, what tends to happen is that commodities go up. But that's not a good short-term investing strategy, of course, because right now it still seems to be, everything seems to be going well. People continue to buy treasury bonds. The best strategy you can have is to diversify, because we don't know exactly when the crisis is going to hit, and you might lose out on gains in these other markets right now if you go too conservative or you go into commodities too early. So you want to diversify so that if the stock market takes a big hit, you're not completely exposed. And of course, as you are aging, you want to become more conservative. But I don't know that treasury bonds are going to be the safe asset that people have considered it to be in the long run, given our fiscal situation and the pressures that our government is experiencing.
A related question from Simon Templer is, if the dollar collapses, what good would gold and silver be, as its value is measured in dollars? So if the dollar is worthless, how much will gold and silver be worth?
Yeah, but you can measure the gold and silver in other currencies as well. It's not pegged to the dollar. That's just one way of considering it. The point of gold and silver is that they can be more safe stores of value, especially during a crisis. I think when we hit a crisis, people will go into commodities. Some of those commodities will be gold and silver, but it might also be oil and other such tradable commodities. And it will also, I think, because we now have other currencies, cryptocurrency, digital currencies, I think that you will also see an increase in the value of those as people are looking to diversify, and it will be unclear where that safe place is. But gold and silver those are commodities that can be denominated in any currency. So they will go up in value as people flee out of the dollar into these other safer stores of value. And gold, has been for much of human history been actually a relatively stable store of value, and we have a long history of using gold to stabilize currency. The United States, until not too long ago, had actually a gold backing. They abandoned that in the 70s because of the cost of the Vietnam War, and we no longer have that. And now we just have a free-floating fiat currency with no gold backing. Which unfortunately also makes it possible for the government to potentially put us into a severe fiscal crisis, because there's nothing to restrain them except their constituents, politics, but no fixed asset, nothing there to prevent the federal government from creating too much money and causing inflation in the long run.
Yeah, and instead of the Vietnam War, now we have hundreds of military bases all over the world, and basically a war going on somewhere at any point in time, always. So certainly that's continuing. Robert Bell asks, when are we going to admit the only way to stop these people is to get money out of their hands? We talk and talk and talk, but as long as the dark side has American citizens' tax dollars to finance them, they will not stop their agendas. Yeah.
So I think we need to think about monetary and fiscal policy together, because we need fiscal rules to restrain politicians from spending too much and from feeding the demands of special interest groups that they knock on legislators' doors every single day asking for more spending here, more help for this program, etc. Fiscal rules to restrain the spending, but then we also need monetary rules to restrain the discretion of the so-called independent central banks, when it oftentimes doesn't appear that they are so independent after all. And they too tend to be responsive, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Japan, the major economies. We see the central banks be very responsive to politics. And so the way to restrain that ability to use so much discretion is with monetary rules.
Yeah. So how do you achieve either of those goals? Because in the start of the first one, you mentioned fiscal restraint on politicians, but if the politicians are the one who make their laws, they would have to make them to restrain themselves?
Yeah, see, that's the problem. Now, there is some movement, at least in the United States, where states are talking about a compact it's called Compact for America, to use an Article 5 convention to impose a balanced budget amendment on the federal government as a constitutional amendment. So there you have state lawmakers driving that process. But yes, we're pretty much asking lawmakers to tie their own hands, and that has been done. It is not impossible, but what is required is an engaged citizenry that demands that their lawmakers be put in handcuffs, if you will, not literally, of course, but figuratively speaking, when it comes to the federal budget. And one of the moves we're pushing in this space is no budget, no pay, as a beginning to force lawmakers to be held accountable for their fiscal decisions. Because one of the ways that lawmakers are getting away with out of control spending right now is that they're not even considering or passing a budget resolution in any given year. So we're just spending as if there's no limit, with no consideration for the broader fiscal impact. And there has been growing interest in Congress for no budget, no pay, which I think can be one step towards adopting a balanced budget amendment in the long run. I think that's what ultimately will be required. So it's possible, but we need a educated, vigilant, and demanding citizenry that makes lawmakers do what they would otherwise be reluctant to do. And with that, I'm going to need to excuse myself, Donegan. It's been a real pleasure, even though we always talk about such gloomy scenarios. I appreciate the opportunity to come on again and talk with you and your listeners today.
Thank you for spending this time with us. Romina Boccia is with the Heritage Foundation. You can find her at heritage.org. Romina, thanks for joining us here on Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you.
They say the stock market crashed today.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sounds like people's retirement accounts and savings accounts are going to get bailed into the banks.
Yeah.
Looks like pension plans and Social Security are going to get suspended too.
I know.
Sure, I'm glad we decided to put our money into gold and silver instead.
Me too.
Get your gold and silver and support this channel at goldsilver.com/?AFF=RP. Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.